Awesome. Well, we're here to tell you a story about how we took something from first principles, adopted material, and turned it into an Android app. So let's get started. But first, a bit of extra introductions. I'm Carlos. I'm a designer at ANZ, but also I'm a designer at Itty Bitty Apps by Mantle Group. Fun little fact, the GDG logo, I designed that. And this is Ani.
Hey, good day everyone. My name is Ani. I'm a staff engineer at ANZX and I'm part of the tech enablement team, basically looking after UI components, accessibility, and a billion other things. But yeah.
Awesome. All right. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be talking about everything design related. And then halfway through, I'm going to pass it over to Ani to talk about how we took something from design all the way to code. So this is sort of a run through of what we'll be talking about today. I'm going to talk about why we embrace native, a little bit of a run through of material design, a bit of a flashback, theming material, designing for scale, and then I'm going to throw it up to Ani, who's going to set the scene, talk about how we implemented the design library, taking advantage of latest technologies with Compose, and a little bit of goodies toward the end. So let's get started. So a bit of context, actually. What is ANZ Plus? This is ANZ Plus. Specifically, this is the Android app. It looks beautiful. This is the native Android experience for ANZ Plus. And I could talk a whole lot about ANZ Plus, but the easiest way is to just go to the website, anz.com.au/plus. Lots to look into there. But I won't be talking about the features. I won't be talking about all the things we've shipped and everything related to the whole financial well-being as a whole within ANZ Plus. I'm here to talk about how we built the Android app. So how did we get from this to today? First, why native? We wanted to design for familiarity. That was sort of the basis of it. By the way, full disclosure, I'm not here to tell you which way of developing is the right or wrong way. It doesn't have to be native. It could be native. It could be cross-platform. But we're here to tell you why we chose native. And it's partly because we wanted to design for familiarity. And it's sort of based and revolves around these three things. First of all, on-device technology. We wanted to take advantage of the latest tech on device. People who buy Android phones expect to get Android apps in their phones. That's the whole reason why they bought those phones in the first place. And what's really cool, one of the examples where we're sort of taking advantage of on-device tech is there's an experience in the app where you activate a card. So on iOS, we actually use core technologies like Vision to use the camera to scan the text in the card. While on Android, instead of us trying to build a Vision library from scratch, Android phones have NFC. That's cool. They don't have that. We're going to use that. So we used it on Android. You just tap your card onto your phone. It's activated, just like that. Second is performance. It's a world of difference to use an app that feels like it's built for the device it's meant for. It's a whole world of difference. And on top of that, we actually get to do a little bit of wiggle room to innovate. So I could go on about this, but we have this really cool tech in the app where when you tap the app, it loads immediately. You don't have to wait for a login. You don't have to wait for it to download anything new. It just works. It feels like it's supposed to be there, just like every other Android app. It's pretty cool. And third is accessibility. We want to stand on the shoulders of giants. There's a lot of accessibility features that are baked in already to the OS, and we just wanted to take advantage of that. On top of that, using some of the stuff that are built into the device, it's familiar and expected, and it's already standards for the people using the device. So let's just use that. Overall, the whole point of going native, why we chose to do that is we're designing for familiarity. People expect the things they expect. Now let's get into material design. Full disclosure, this was done way back before Material 3 came out. And so we're sort of in a transition to go from Material 2 to Material 3. You'll sort of see that in our designs. But let's give it a bit of a throwback to all the way to Material 2. Now that's a bit familiar. Very ubiquitous. Light, shadow, colors. These components, you look at it and be like, no, that's material. I know that one. So this is the material sort of starting set of components. There's a lot more in the library, but this is what you see. But what is material? Let's take it back to first principles. Material, I remember when they demoed this way back, trying to explain to the designers, trying to sell them into the vision. Material is this idea that, oh, we looked at real world objects. We looked at pieces of paper. We put light and we sort of studied them and like moved paper up and down. It was pretty cool. The idea was introducing this idea of spatial sort of metaphors to 2D screens. And the material is the metaphor. The idea is you get something that sort of sits on the flat surface, you have a light, you bring it closer to the user, you bring it closer to your eyes, further up, it gets brighter and the shadow gets bigger. And what this does is it establishes hierarchy. You can sort of see that in a lot of material components. And then they sort of started playing around with color. A good design system starts with color. And building on the principles, if you remember Brad Frost's atomic design, the idea is when you're building a design system, you start with a very basic set of components, tokens actually, where you have colors, typography, really core principles like corner radiuses. And the idea is you start with these puzzle pieces like atoms, then you combine those atoms into larger molecules. So combinations of color, typography to make larger components, compounds. And if you combine the compounds, you get something much bigger. So you get colors, components, to full screens, to full user experiences, atomic design. So this is their core set of colors, one of the atoms in material design. This is the typography set. It's a pretty extensive typography set, pretty versatile. In fact, they're still using most of it today, which is stood the test of time. And you can sort of see that take place in the components that they have. There's the typography that you saw before, the colors that you saw before, various shades of gray. And you can sort of see that dialogues, which are supposed to be closer to the user, have more shadow, so on and so forth. You sort of see all the pieces start to come together. But what's cool about this, with this design system, material was designed to be themable. The idea was you could take all of those puzzle pieces, the elevation, the colors, the typography, and change them. You can change one, you can change the other, or change them all, but the principles are all the same. So for example, you can have it green with more rounded corners, or something like blue. If you look at this closely, this is actually the ANZ Blue from the other app. This is actually, fun fact, this is actually how we started designing the first version of ANZ Plus. We just took material, changed it a bit, AKA changed the colors, changed the corner radii, but we kept everything the same because material was solid. We had the goal in mind of sticking to material because that felt right and native on the phone. People expected that on their Android phones. But of course, we still had room to grow, and this was early days. So how do we take it from this to the app we have today? And how do we theme material while at the same time keeping it to a consistent brand, evolving it to a brand that doesn't feel too material, but still feels very much ANZ Plus? And here's how we did that. Let's theme material. So let's start with typography, basics. People need to read stuff on screen. Should we change it? No, no need. We like it. The material designs, typefaces are pretty good. In fact, we kept everything down to the font itself. Roboto's pretty good, so we kept it. Next, the materials itself. Google Material Design offers quite a suite, an extensive collection of different elevation levels. Again, the idea is the materials the metaphor. You can choose to have content further closer to the user or closer to the surface and establish hierarchy. But that's too much to play with. So what we chose to do instead was we sort of picked and chose certain elevations. That way, we're not flooding the user with a lot of cognitive overload or overhead. And we decided, okay, let's just pick the ones that made sense to us so that we're not abusing all of it. So you can sort of see we've started to establish hierarchy. We kept a background. We kept 1 dp, so these are units of elevation for items on top of the background. Buttons can be slightly higher, so we can sort of entice the user to tap them. App bars, fab, so these sort of sit on top of content. Sheets, so these things go over the screen. Then over the sheets are dialogues. So you can sort of start to see we've started to sort of throw away 3dp, 6dp, 8dp, 16. We sort of, what we're trying to do is sort of establish a discrete set of hierarchy. Then colors. So remember the material set of colors, the idea is they're themable. As we were sort of building out in the early days of ANZ Plus, we wanted to we had a full sort of brand redesign. These are the new colors that we got. They're gorgeous, beautiful. The whole point was to sort of express a new digital language for the app. So how do we turn this, how do we take sort of all of these colors and distill it into something that worked with materials colors? Well, we tried to do some mapping and sort of we picked what made sense. There's our primary blue. We picked our secondary, which is our deep blue, our surface, our background colors, and we changed the grays because to match our main brand grays, it sort of felt at home with the other colors that we had. And we even extended materials colors. So we chose a semantic red, a semantic orange for warnings, and a semantic green. And these are sort of tone shifted from materials colors to match more of our own colors. So it feels right at home with the rest of our colors. Next, icons. This one's fun. Originally, we were using a lot of Google's material icons. It's a really good set of icons. Nothing wrong with them. But as we were going through our brand redesign, one of the things we wanted to do was create an icon set that felt at home next to our new typeface. Actually, fun challenge. Maybe next time you're out, you see the ANZ Plus billboard, have a look closely at the fonts and have a look closely at the icons in the app. The icons are actually designed to have the same styles and proportions as the typeface. It's very cool what the team did. But what we did to take it to the next level is we actually applied Material's own icon grid. It's a really good grid. And we needed to use the same principles that Material had to effectively theme Material icons to match our new icon style. And what we ended up doing is created a painstaking set of a lot of icons, replacing everything that we used on the Material side, themed it, and made it our own. And there's a lot of icons in that set. So now you can sort of start to see the pieces come together. We got the typography, the surfaces, the colors, the icons. So this is the original Material set. This is what it looks like today. We didn't change much. Well, we changed a lot, but it just still feels very Material. It still feels at home. These are the app bar, tab bar, and segmented controls. That's what it looks like for us today. Exactly the same components, just themed. These are now our custom components. So we've got repeatable components for things like list items, controls, common text lockups, common messaging bubbles, and other groups of content. You can sort of start to see we still kept to the material design principles. What was going through our head was, okay, well, if Google could come up with their own designs for components, like what we tried to do actually was, we pretended we were in the Google office and said, what if we could come up with that components as Google and then theme it? So we what we always do is we always start with the principles that we have. Let's try and start with material and then theme it instead of working our way back to try and make it feel material, because it will feel like an afterthought. We took that even further. So there were cases when some components were missing, or we felt like we needed a little bit more from Google's material set of controls. Well, we made our own. One of the fun ones, for example, you'll notice the banner there. We sort of customized that to sort of make it work to our use case. We needed extra text. To something as fun as those custom sliders that sort of have a little bit of haptic feedback and sort of nudge as you move across the screen. So yeah, that's the full set of controls, all feeling very material, but still feeling very ANZ Plus. And because of tokens, of course, we didn't forget about dark mode. So it looks pretty cool. So how do we take all of those components and design for scale? This is actually a double pun here. Scale is in, because we now have 40 designers in the ANZ Plus design team, how do we keep that sort of those molecules, those atoms, those components, so that one side of the app feels the same as another side of the app? Well, we actually took another page from Google. We took this thing called sticker sheets. So the idea is, you'll sort of notice it in the Figma libraries, but the idea is we create a set of screens that are actually one-to-one with the current implementation. So you have designers looking at the build and building it as if they were trying to copy the screen using the components we have today. And the idea is somewhere in Figma, it's a sort of shared resource for all our designers. They can look at it and take an existing screen and build on top of it. It's sort of like starting points. And that way, designers can sort of look at, oh, how did we do a screen like this, or a screen like a form? We can just take an existing screen that's technically already been built and change it a bit. And that makes designing screens so much faster. And it sort of helps with consistency too. You can sort of start to see that home screen of the app feels and looks consistent to something on the other side of the app, like messaging someone in the support section of the app. All feels very consistent. Speaking of scale, our components were actually designed to stretch and scale for different screen widths. It's very, so one of the new things that came out of Material 2 and sort of leading into Material 3 was this idea of designing for foldables, designing for tablets, designing for wide screens. This isn't new. This is responsive web design taken to mobile. And I think the biggest thing we've learned is you can never predict what the screen size will actually be. So you kind of have to make sure your design is defensive enough that when you stretch and scale, it kind of works in the screen size that you've got. And that's the app we have today. We took material and turned it into something that we have that looks like this. Now I'm going to hand it over to Annie to set the scene.
Yeah, so let's talk about our engineering team and basically how we're working in ANZ Plus. So our actual install audience is over 100,000 users on Android. And as Lucas mentioned, we're actually releasing very rapidly. So we release twice a week to the Play Store, to real customers. We do nightly alpha releases with internal users, and every single merge to main basically goes to internal users. So every single change that we do from like a design system side of things actually has to be really, really high quality. There's no escaping it. We have 40 designers, as Carlos has mentioned, 70 plus Android engineers, and we're constantly growing. And this is not talking about the iOS engineers as well. So we've got a team of 150 engineers on our app. And that means that our design system actually has to support a lot of our colleagues. We'll focus on the Android side of things. So let's talk about how we actually implement the design library from principles and a little bit of code. Let's talk about contribution models first. So there's three which I'll sort of talk about, and we'll talk about what we're doing at Plus. The first one is the democratic model. So basically everyone can contribute. And this is really open and inclusive. Basically it helps reduce points of failure because if you can build something yourself, that means that you don't have to wait for someone to do it for you. And as a bit of a consequence, you might have lower consistency. It just really depends. There's the restricted contributor model. So you might have like one engineer or a small group of engineers who build things for you, but this can overload contributors and you don't want burnout for your team. But it really, really promotes consistency on the other side. But what we have at ANZ Plus is actually a democratic and a DRI model. So DRI is directly responsible individual. Hi, that's me. And I'm basically a point of accountability, a point of consultancy, and I may develop components. So just because you have this mantle of accountability, it doesn't mean you have to do everything. You can share the load with your team. What I like to also talk about is this sort of tiers of reuse for your components as well. So you have one shelf, feature-specific, cross-feature, or app-specific, and this is going to sound weird because you can have app-specific things, but we'll go into that later. You have truly reusable. So you've seen from like the core system that Carlos has built out with the design team. And you know, these components can actually move between the tiers willy-nilly based on design changes and evolution. They can move up and they can actually move down too. Well, actually that's maybe the other way around, but yeah, you get the point. So let's talk about some rules that you can actually set in place for implementing and migrating components. So you want to avoid things like having domain and feature coupling. As soon as you start introducing features to it, you're creating specialized use cases, so you don't have a truly reusable component. I love Yagni. You ain't gonna need it. So the Lotus slider component that we actually built, it's been in our design system for 2 years. We didn't build it until 2 months ago. That became our first global reusable use case for it, and we found benefits from using some alpha code in Compose that I won't talk about, but it works really well. That's actually made us build it better. Dry. Everyone knows don't repeat yourself, but you don't have to ascribe it to it every single time. It's a really powerful tool for being cutthroat, but at the same time, it's not the be-all and end-all. Rule of 3 is also super powerful, 3 cross-cutting use cases. You can also use judgment, so have a look at obvious feature use cases. Convenience also helps your engineering team for this, and there's also keep it simple smart. Quick thing about code.org. Basically, you're going to hear me say this a lot, but you want to communicate with your design team for this one, and you want to have maximum alignment. So there's a couple of things that we'll have a look at look at this. So we'll have a couple of things for this, but it's important to talk to kind of everyone involved from design to engineering about this. One of the things we do is we actually have a standalone UI module, and this creates a forceful boundary between your design system and your code, like app code. And you want to make the assumption that whatever's in that core library is actually going to be used across multiple apps. Forces you to think. You also want to have really good packaging, because if you have a giant dump of all the components, which you might have now, it makes things very intuitive and easy to find if there's groups of things together. And also you want things to be well named. And if you have not quite agreements on things, you can still talk to design and find the right balance for things. You want to use things like semantics and purpose, and also invariant first naming is really powerful. For your engineers, basically, you want a pile of ease of use. So building on top of material, we also introduce our own color palette stuff. Those are extension functions on material colors. It doesn't have to be complicated. You also want to have standardized patterns for reuse. So being able to suit different gutter sizes on tablets, that's just utility. And you want to make them easy to find and use. And you can also implement things like lint checks or detect checks to like automate your code compliance and quality. And taking a quick page about Brad Frost's atomic design, you want to think about your atoms, your molecules, your organisms, your templates. So you want to combine components into screen templates. You can reflect the stick sheet as much as you can within rationality, but just make sure you don't do everything God components, because you want to solve sensible use cases. And speaking about evolution, so big shout out to Luke as well about Zero Tech Debt, is you also want to make sure that you're on top of code changes and design system changes. So you might want to have versioning as well as part of your design system, but we've not needed that. And you want to observe organic changes that developers and engineers might do as they sort of start problem solving. So a super quick thing that we do is we just have an annotation, and it's just documentation. It's not kept, it's just there for us. Helps us find things out. And obviously supporting every screen and everything. So basically, we want to make sure that we can support as many users as possible. You have basic foundations as part of your design system. And some of the things that we're looking into are, for example, like materials, we know class sizes library. We might want to adapt and use that. So I did mention I'm also the DRI for accessibility. So basically, if you do things as part of your design library first, evaluate early, evaluate often, and make your components accessible from the get-go, it's very, very easy to scale. So all the components are basically accessible first. And just let's talk about a quick bit of tooling. So obviously documentation is king. The more you have against your code, the better. You don't have to document everything, but just enough to help improve things. There's also previews. We're also exploring Figma and dev mode. So we are linking things like GitHub references, literal permalinks to our code. So whenever you're building a screen, you can just right-click a component, know exactly where it is in our code base and find it. And one more shout out is also to Isaac, who also presented earlier today, is on snapshot testing. So he ended up building this out for ANZ Plus. So there's a bunch of libraries out there, and yeah, you can pick and choose what you need to make sure that UI changes are very successful. Just be careful of theming changes, because if you change a color or two, you might have 400 snapshots, and checking that into GitHub is not fun at all. So let's talk about Compose really quickly. I won't tell you really how to build components in Compose, because a button's a button's a button. It's just theming, right? But let's talk about how we're using it. Basically, declarative DSL, you kind of know what it is already. We've basically converted our entire app, nearly pretty much all, to Compose. And we've been on top of our tech debt to have a consistent design system for it. But the big thing with Compose is it's just Kotlin. So utilize the language features that make sense for you. And here's some stuff that we've used. So just before we go into that really quickly, let's quickly talk about some of our patterns, and let's talk about the API surface. So it's really easy to kind of have everything public, but sometimes you intentionally want to hide things as part of your components. So make sure you have a good public and private API for components, and you only expose what's really necessary to use it. And yeah, you can basically make private composables if you need to. It's super straightforward. You also want to manage variations, and we'll see some other techniques, but you can use enums, which is fine, but there's a couple different ways of approaching it as well. So obviously you can make vanilla composables, that's fine. Composables also have composable slots where you can put composables inside another composable. And you can fill slots kind of by doing nothing and just letting everything sort of build, everyone kind of build it for every single use case. You can pass in configuration objects, or there's actually this thing called the layout scope DSL API. And this helps you create APIs of well-known patterns, which you can still actually extend on top of. And I've done a talk on this on GDG, which you can check out later. Some other patterns that we also use is basically you can have objects with operator functions. So invoke is super powerful. This is really, really good for actually creating single variation components with a lot of configuration objects for it. And that's actually from a code base. I've just hidden the code within it. Also, you can have an object with individual functions for each of your variations. So super powerful. You can also have a common internal implementation that everything else uses. It just keeps things clean and keeps things highly discoverable. And also just a quick one on previewing composables. Do it often, just make sure you're practical about it. Show what makes sense. You don't have to exhaust everything. We just do screens as well as components, but yeah, it's up to you how you configure it. Just while we're talking about composables, let's talk about some helpers. So we actually make extensive use of preview groups. So if you're doing a screen, we'll create a helper for your theme and surface, and also we'll preview on phones in light and dark theme. We'll also preview against small form factor devices for screens as well as tablets. Components can just use light and dark. It's nice and straightforward, and you can use one scaling just for the fun of it, or for special accessibility cases. So let's talk about some of the other cool stuff, the goodies as part of it. Let's talk about the playground. Here's actually a quick little demo. We actually built out a completely different app to show all of our UI components. Just want to get to the end of this one. So you might have seen all of these spending bubbles and everything as part of ANZ Plus. It's actually a gaming physics engine, which is really awesome. And we can actually preview that in real time in a real app. So yeah, you're probably going, yeah, if you have previews, isn't this a little bit redundant? It actually isn't for us. What really happens is it really depends on the audience for your catalog app. For engineering, it's actually a code sample and a reference. It's a highly searchable index. It's demonstrable. You can play around with things and you can have a lot of fun with it. You can also kick it over to your iOS engineers and compare and chat. For design, you can show what you've built right now. For quality, you can use it to test. For accessibility, you can use it to test. For product, you can demonstrate what you can do. And when you're building things, it also helps you understand patterns while you're building out components. Like I said with previews, we don't actually have them bleed across into the catalog app because it helps stop incorrect usage. We do a couple different things. So you can showcase all variations on a screen. Just create a simple screen, show off the different variations. We do views as well as compose, but the views will die soon because we'll be completely fully composed. But the really cool one is actually the interactive playground version of it. So why do you need to just dump things on a screen when you can make it highly interactive, highly configurable, highly useful? And it's really, really cool, right? Yeah. Here's a couple of things that we've built out as engineering just to showcase components and their behaviors. This is really good for lots of variations as well. Just one last thing to say about this is that basically whatever you build out, it has to be production quality. So demonstrate your best practices, show it, don't tell it. It's just another form of Docker. And also dog food your own components. So it's a better way of demonstrating your components. So just sort of wrapping up, there's the last thing in collaboration. Basically, we've established a really, really good culture of change at ANZ Plus. So one of the big things is that our engineers are actually empowered to actually make changes and make the suggestions for it. And we've seen some really good suggestions from engineering to actually contribute things to the application. And also designers can actually develop. So Carlos has actually built out our drop-down components on Android. It's really good to see him contributing as well. in terms of code. And I'm going to say this again, communication. So communicate and collaborate with your Android engineers, your design team. Don't forget your iOS engineers as well, especially if you're working cross-functionally. You'd be surprised what you learn from them. Over-communicate, communicate often, and we have regular syncs and feedback channels for communication. So that's from design to code.
We'll take it down to a bit of a summary, just to summarize, just to give you everything that we've learned in 6 points. So first off, embrace material. Don't go against the grain. The material is there to help. Second, if material isn't there to help you out, you can actually just adopt it and adapt it. Change it the way you need, the same way we've done it before. And third, from the design side, the system is the tool. Design the components themselves, and it becomes a building blocks to something much bigger.
Yeah, and from the engineering side of things, design your code base, make it easy to use and access and demonstrate things. You want to compose with Compose. Compose is the future. Views can get out of here. Also, make sure to keep demonstrating and collaborating. That's ANZ Plus.
Yeah, that's ANZ Plus. Thanks, everyone.